This morning, the Thunder confirmed that Chet Holmgren did in fact suffer a Lisfranc injury on this play, and as a result, will miss the entire upcoming NBA season. Welcome back, everybody. I'm Dr. Brian Sutterer, and this video is going to be an update with the news that Chet will in fact be out for the whole season. The news that Chet will miss the entire upcoming season implies that he's headed for a surgery, and this is a really big deal. These Lisfranc injuries are serious injuries, especially when they require surgery. So this is not some minor thing that the Thunder are just trying to tank and use as a reason to do so. I saw a better view of what happened with Chet's right foot that I think explains things a little bit more clearly. And these Lisfranc injuries happen with two different mechanisms. The first, which we see probably more commonly in a sport like football, is whenever somebody has their foot plantar flexed, meaning the ball of their foot is down on the ground with their heel lifted up, and another player like a lineman falls on the back of their heel. What that does when your foot is bent upwards in plantar flexion and then you give this axial load is it introduces this shear force through the midfoot right at that Lisfranc complex. So that's mechanism one, more contact. The second is when somebody tries to push off and change direction. So again, plantar flexion, you push the forefoot outwards, which causes what we call an abduction moment through that midfoot ligament, and basically stresses that Lisfranc complex. So what we see here with Chet in his right foot, as he steps backward, we can see that forefoot swing outward as he explodes up into plantar flexion. So it's that quick little movement of his foot that introduces all of that force through the midfoot, potentially leading to these injuries, and for certain, like we found out with Chet. Recalling our anatomy of the foot, the Lisfranc ligament runs between the medial cuneiform bone right here and the base of the second metatarsal. So it's gonna be this little guy right here that I've circled in blue. It looks small, it looks like it's not that big of a deal, but it's like the sort of Jenga block that you might pull out that if it gets injured, can cause the rest of the midfoot stability to essentially collapse. Some people pointed out there was a step just before this right there where he lands and sort of rolls a little bit onto the outside of his foot. This could certainly put some extra stress on his foot, but without that plantar flexion being up on the ball of his feet, I wouldn't expect it to injure the Lisfranc complex. So I truly think it was this moment where he stepped back. And I know people are going to look at this and say, well, his shoe looked like it slipped. I got to admit, it's hard to know how much of that played a clear role here, if that was the exact cause versus this happening on a dry court. These things happen on dry courts all the time when there's no slipping. So I don't think you can look in this and say with 100% certainty that the court is what caused the injury. This x-ray, not of Chet's foot, does a good job of demonstrating what happens when that ligament is injured. So what we're looking at right here is going to be where that Lisfranc ligament runs between the medial cuneiform and the base of the second metatarsal. You can see though, there's this big gap right here between the first metatarsal and the second. That's because that joint is unstable because the ligament is torn. And when it's unstable, that whole midfoot arch is just basically has no structural integrity and can just collapse. One of the more common ways that surgery will be done to fix this is actually putting some sort of hardware, plates, screws, across that joint to stabilize the joint while that ligament heals. So it's a big deal. It's a major surgery. It's not some little scope or washout sort of thing. You're trying to stabilize and fix a joint that is very complex and has a lot of movement. Also know there's varying degrees of this type of injury, so it can be purely the ligament only. Sometimes there's fractures involved here, and other times there can be more ligaments torn throughout that midfoot. So it's not just the one single ligament like we most often hear about. It can be a whole spectrum of injuries, obviously with different levels of severity. The final discussion point that I'm sure will be brought up is Chet's frame and the narrative before the draft that he was injury prone and that a guy built like him could never survive in the NBA, and now people are going to use this as an excuse to justify that storyline. A Lisfranc injury like this is really not one that I would think of as fitting that narrative of Chet supposedly being injury prone. Certainly the fact that Chet is taller and a bigger guy, and now is probably going to have had foot surgery with potentially hardware in his foot, raises a lot of questions for things down the road, because obviously the more you put hardware in a foot, especially complex joint like the Lisfranc, the more at risk you are of long-term complications like with any surgery, but obviously with big men and foot injuries, we're a little bit more sensitive to this. The only health narrative that I felt like held any water before the draft with Chet was just the durability aspect of getting bumped around, knocked around, and sort of accumulating that type of wear on the body. Not necessarily these acute, sudden foot injuries that frankly can happen to anybody. If we see any future updates, I'll be sure and do another video to address those, but hopefully the second one with the new confirmation of what happened was still educational and you all were able to learn something along the way. Let me know as always any questions or comments down below, and until next time, we'll see you later.